Okay, it looks like a critical mass now, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you join us for Arnold & Porter's ESG investigation series. This is part 2, learning best practices from missteps in congressional investigations. And of course, we're going to be talking about congressional investigations in the ESG area, as well as more generally. I just have a few logistical issues to address before we get started. I'm Amy Jeffress, and I'm joined today by Janice Bashford and Mark Epley, and we will introduce ourselves in a moment. But before we get started, just a few tips. One is that we will be taking questions during this presentation. We'll be trying to answer your questions. And so in order to submit questions, just move your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see a Q&A icon. Click on that icon and type in your question, and we will try to address those as we go through the presentation. If we don't reach your question, please feel free to reach out to us after the event, and we'd love to talk to you further about any of the issues we talk about today. I also want to let you know that we will be following up on the presentation by sending each of you an email message, and that will have the materials from today's presentation, as well as information on CLE credit for those of you who would like to submit for CLE credit. So with that, I think I will get started and introduce myself, and then I'll let Janice and Mark introduce themselves, and then we'll go through the presentation. I'm Amy Jeffress, and I'm the co-chair of the White Collar Defense and Investigations Practice Group based out of our Washington, D.C. office. And among other things, we do a lot of work in congressional investigations, especially in this Congress, which is expected to be very active, and we're seeing signs of that already. So with that, I'll turn to Janice. And Janice, would you like to introduce yourself? And then we'll turn to Mark.
Well, thank you, Amy. My name is Janice Bashford. I started on Capitol Hill in the 1990s. And I left Capitol Hill just slightly coming into 3 years ago to join Arnold & Porter. So you can say that I grew up on the Hill, started my career working for Senator Kerry in both his personal office and committee staff, and then transitioned over to the House side where I worked for Sheila Jackson Lee, Maxine Waters, and also Karen Bass, now the mayor of LA. And I worked in the capacity of both personal office and committee staff. So if it happened on the Hill while I was there, I was probably engaged in some way. Mark?
Well, very good. So Janice and I are colleagues on the public policy team, our bipartisan effort. We help our clients deal with congressional scrutiny. Among the things that I was privileged to do on the Hill is serve as oversight counsel of the House Financial Services Committee. I led oversight for the House Ways and Means Committee. And then in my last job on Capitol Hill, I worked for House Speaker Paul Ryan as counsel. And in that job, I provided oversight of all the investigatory functions of the House, including overseeing the work of the House General Counsel, which is the instrument through which House seeks to enforce its subpoenas or litigate on behalf of the House.
That's terrific. And my government experience was mostly at the Justice Department, where I served for 20 years, 13 of those at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. I also had a few positions in Main Justice where I helped some with congressional testimony, but I've learned a lot from my colleagues in the Legislative and Public Policy Group, especially Mark and Janice, and I'm delighted to present with them today. So why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll just give an overview of our series. We've already presented on state attorney general, antitrust, and FTC investigations. That was a few weeks ago. And today we're focused on congressional investigations. And we have two more presentations planned for this series, one on internal investigations and another on SEC investigations. And so stay tuned for those dates coming up later, likely this summer. Why don't we go to the next slide? I just thought I'd give an overview. I think today's presentation is very important because we are seeing a lot of activity in this area in Congress. And so it's a good area to focus on. We're waiting for the SEC to issue regulations on ESG. Those were supposed to be out in April. And so the SEC is a bit delayed in getting those regulations out. But once those are out, I think we will we'll see more activity. And we've just outlined a few of the areas of potential activity in addition to congressional activity from state attorneys general and U.S. enforcement authorities, including the Department of Justice and the FTC. So these are areas that we expect to see a lot more activity in coming forward. But as we said, the focus today is on Congress. So why don't we go to the next slide? And perhaps I'll let Mark start talking about what Congress is looking at as a general matter.
Very good. Well, so as Amy indicated, and if you were to have participated in the first part, you would have seen sort of traditional enforcement authorities being exercised. Today, we're talking about very different authorities, that how Congress investigates its authorities to do that, and what its purposes are. These are different than we examined last time we met. And likewise, ESG in the earlier context, ESG, that was a part of fitting a new theory into existing elements, whether it be consumer protection or deceptive trade practices or competition concerns, fitting ESG into those well-known, well-understood sort of causes of action. Here, we want to distinguish what ESG is in a very sort of practical way with the way in which Congress views it. So we thought we'd lead here. If you look at this slide, this talks about the ESG policy risk. And this, we thought that maybe one analog or one exemplar that shows where the actual rules or the lines are being drawn is to take a look at what the Trump administration did at the Department of Labor as it relates to the fiduciary rule. And so there was a lawmaking or the regulatory undertaking there to indicate to fiduciaries whether and to what extent they could consider ESG, and it was sort of leaned against those factors as being consistent with your duties. And then the Biden administration came in and went the other direction and made clear that you could consider ESG in your investment decisions. That entire rulemaking was then in turn considered by Congress using its special Congressional Review Act authority. And both bodies, the House and this Democratic-controlled Senate, voted to effectively repeal that. That's something the president exercises very first veto authority on, is to stop that repeal. But this we thought was a good place to start, because this actually is the this is sort of the guardrails in regulatory world that are real, not imaginary. But we're going to pivot to the next slide. ESG as a political risk is an entirely different thing. It's a very, unlike a regulatory framework, which is the parameters of which are understood and well known. This is an open vessel into which Congress can pour any sort of meaning. I'll let Janice kind of talk about that.
So, sometimes the thing that's very interesting about ESG or anything that's considered, we'll put it in quote, political, is sometimes common sense and politics don't align. And I think that's now that I'm not on the Hill and I get to spend more time with industry, I am often surprised at how many CEOs are like, they're not going to pay attention to this. And I get the joy of saying, oh no, absolutely. Because just like you have stakeholders, they also have stakeholders that they have to pay attention to. When you're looking at the terms that we're using here, like ESG has come to mean woke capitalism, I will just say the minute that the term woke starts to be used by people over 50, you've already lost Generation Z. You've lost certain stakeholders. ESG can also mean social responsible investing. And when you're hearing dog whistles like woke capitalism, that's when things can be manipulated in ways that are problematic. And I'm going to use an example that I can ensure can meet everyone's baseline of understanding. You'll hear something like woke, then they might get into DEI, and then you'll all of a sudden descend into critical race theory, which is really taught in law schools, but then you'll have parents who are concerned that their 4-year-old is going to be taught critical race theory in schools. And this is where you have to apply a little bit of common sense and think for a moment that 90% of American children attend public school. 45% or more of those youth are white. 80% of the teachers who teach in public school either self-identify or are identified as white. So are we to believe that an overwhelming majority of school teachers are going to teach children lessons that are harmful? That's when you bring it back to common sense and start breaking down these sort of like woke narratives, woke capitalism. This applies to industry because if you run a company and you have a D&I policy and you're educating your workforce in a particular way and you end up in a particular state, you can end up on the lens of Congress being very concerned about how you are or are not educating your workforce. So on the right, you can end up with people being very concerned about what is being taught. And then on the left, you can end up with people who are very concerned on what is being taught. And you're sitting there and you're really thinking, what is catching the political winds at the time is leading the day. That if you don't know what an engram is, for Google, if you're thinking like Google Travel, and Google engram is similar to that. And we have the dates listed from the 1900s. We know that Google did not exist in the 1900s, but the graph is really just to show you how one word in the English language, so in the blue, all of a sudden woke trended all the way up. It's trended up so much that we barely even know what it means. And that's the same thing that happens with ESG. Most people really don't understand what ESG is, and they don't understand that ESG is 3 separate things, the E, the S, and the G. And politicians, being very creative, are very effective at using that as a tool. So I use critical race theory as an example because I think up until probably the last 3-4 years, most people hadn't even heard of the term. Up until 4 years ago, most people hadn't heard the term woke. These things just take off in very unpredictable ways. And then when you bring things back to common sense, politics is not always about common sense. So I will switch. So Amy, you want to say something?
No, these are the kinds of comments, Janice, that you were talking about. You're free to make now that you wouldn't have. These are
the types of comments that I am definitely free to make now that I never have been as a congressional staffer ever.
Yeah. So Mark is going to talk next about what we see Congress focusing on in the ESG arena in the recent weeks and in the weeks to come. So why don't we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Right. So this. We'll kind of go through these fairly quickly, but this is to give you a sense that this is what Congress, this empty vessel, the term ESG or woke into which meaning can be filled. This is actively the stuff of agenda making, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle. So today, actually, the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability is having a hearing on ESG, and they brought in a couple of state attorneys general who have challenge some of the institutional investors that manage their pension funds. If we want to continue onto the next slide. House Financial Services Committee. The chair of the House Financial Services Committee has actually created a all Republican working group on ESG. So that gives you some indication of that it's viewed as a partisan issue, at least in part. And it's an effort for the Republicans to get their ducks in a row in terms of figuring out how they want to speak to it. It's led by Bill Huizenga. Bill Huizenga had been the chair or the ranking member of the Capital Markets Committee, so he has some sophistication in securities and public companies, and now he's actually the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee. If we want to go to the next slide there. And I'll invite Janice to and jump in here to she's an alum of the Judiciary Committee, and so
I'm
What do they
gonna-
got in store? What do they got planned, Janice?
I'm going to quickly refer back to the hearing that's being held by Comer today for oversight, and just flag that we are going to be putting out a blog post for that hearing. So Attorney General Reyes and Attorney General Marshall from Utah and Alabama are actively suing on this issue. And they brought in, the treasurer for the state of Illinois to talk about sustainability investment. We were happy to share with everyone a summary of that hearing in real time today. As for the subpoena risk, when Jim Jordan is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and so when you see an effort in which you're looking closely at the language, it says, violate U.S. antitrust laws. What extent the climate action facilitate collusion to promote ESG related goals. When you receive a letter like that, it's almost heart stopping, right? This is what's going on in terms of the view of ESG. How are you going to respond to your ESG risk? Chairman of committee can engage by organizing a letter, and the letter alone can result in particular behaviors being changed in the corporate space. Going on to the next slide, Mark.
Yeah, so there's a couple more examples. Some of these involve senators. The Republican does not control the Senate, but one should not imagine that that's of no account. They have a particular power in that they can affect whether the president's nominees for various agencies can get confirmed or not, or certainly the kinds of things that they must speak to. So quickly, this is interesting. So Senator Thune, who's the Republican whip, second most ranking Republican, along with Tim Scott, who's the ranking member of Banking Committee, very interested to see whether Secretary Yellen is using this often rarely talked about office, the Federal Insurance Office, to somehow affect and promote ESG, including quote, strong arming insurers to a particular public policy end. You'll take note of Ted Cruz and Jim Jordan again, asking the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco whether and to what extent DEI or ESG affected decision-making within Silicon Valley Bank. Now, of course, some of these, the scrutiny of government decision-making won't directly affect, maybe you might think, hey, that doesn't affect me. But ultimately, if it's a regulator, they have regulated entities, and the way in which Congress sometimes comes to develop facts is to look at the behavior, what regulated entities do and say as an effort to build a record to affect public policy. So this gives you a sense of the breadth of the creativity that goes into filling that empty vessel of what's meant by woke or ESG. There's a lot of creativity behind it, and it's expansive.
Mark, I'll just chime in to say that as we work with clients who are facing inquiries in this area, our clients are telling us that they're making decisions based on what they view as best for their investors. And so, and that's consistent with their goals in their own, carrying out of their corporate responsibilities. So we're advising clients, and this is not political. This is clients who lead companies and are doing what they view as in the best interests of their companies. And so I think one way to respond to these allegations, if you will, is to just be very frank about the corporate responsibility and the goals in order to fulfill their mission. So you can often defuse the politics of this by just being very frank about what your corporation needs to do in order to promote its own goals.
That's good, Amy. Go to the next slide. Good. And I think one of the things we want to inspire in the viewer is today, the participants today, is that imagine how still another audience, you're very good at speaking to your investors, you're very good at speaking to your customers, but there's still another audience on the left and the right on the hill who's going to hear how you talk about yourself differently. We want to zero in on a particular example of an oversight exercise that could arise again, and maybe use that as a little bit of a exemplar from which we can work. So last Congress, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, Patrick Toomey from Pennsylvania, he's no longer a member, he retired. He sent out a letter to 12 different rating agencies. These are entities that purported to provide some sort of metric of the extent to which a company advances certain components of ESG, right? And ask those companies, hey, we want to know what's behind your ratings. From where do you get your data? What is your what's the mechanism by which you determine that? Is there transparency there? Are there conflicts of interest? These kinds of things. They were asked of a dozen of them. Notable there was Senator Toomey didn't have the power to compel. He was also on his way out. But this is the kind of inquiry that a House Financial Services Committee could literally just take right off the shelf, repropound all of those letters, and develop facts with the ability to compel compliance. So we're going to talk a little bit about more how that looks in terms of actual congressional authorities and their limits and some tactics there. We want to go to the next slide.
Oh,
Janice, you want to talk about the Senate? Because
yeah,
this is not just a Republican thing.
this is definitely not just a Republican thing, but I do want to flag something that we didn't put in our reading materials that I think is also very informative for how, as ranking as minority staff, and in this case would be Republican staff in the Senate, can still produce documents that are very profound. Like last year, they wrote a report called "The New Emperors Responding to the Growing Influence of the Big Three Asset Managers." If you haven't read this report, it's about 20 pages and well worth your time to get a true perspective of how Republicans are viewing this argument. This same report is what will be used over on the House side now that Republicans have the power on the House side. In terms of this slide for the Democrats and oversight in the Senate, you know, ESG, just as a reminder, is just data collection. And I will flag that the Senate has Democrats now are in charge of both the Senate and the White House. Biden came into office and had an aggressive ESG focus. My former boss, former Senator John Kerry, is now the special president envoy on climate. And now the chair of the Oversight Committee, Comer, is seeking his records. So to really understand what his relationship might be with communist China in a discussion. Now, I will go back to like common sense and then politics. John Kerry won the Purple Heart after serving in the Vietnam War. I don't think that there's really a question of John Kerry's integrity, but these are things that you can end up in these ESG discussions. So when you're looking at the Senate side, you're going to hear things about climate risks. I don't think there's anything on here that you haven't seen before, but the response to the Department of Labor's recent guidelines, it was so important to the president that for the very first veto of his presidency related to the use of the fiduciary duty responsibilities guidelines issued by the Department of Labor. Although it's almost very difficult to pass legislation in this Congress, it is really easy to engage in oversight activities in a wide range of places. One of the things I will flag here that I keep saying over and over is that the Budget Committee under the chairmanship of White House is something that was not reviewed for ESG or in other spaces. White House has decided to transform that particular committee into an aggressive oversight committee, and that's something that we should all pay attention to. I think we can go on to the next slide.
Next slide. Great. So, as I mentioned before, so let's reflect back on this. There's a particular discrete request from Senator Toomey to a dozen rating agencies. Imagine if you're one of those rating agencies asking for your proprietary stuff, what's behind your decision making, if it's now with the House Financial Services Committee, which is the power to issue subpoenas, what would you do? I think it starts with asking the question of what are congressional authorities and what their limits thereof, and then we'll get to tactics. Amy, you want to talk about the authorities behind how it is that they can demand this in the first instance?
That's right. We want to give you a little background of the legal landscape here, and then go into answering the question by giving some, practical tips. So the source of authority is really the lawmaking power of Congress in the Constitution, and Article 1, obviously, of the Constitution. And the courts, when challenges have been brought to Congress's authority to demand information and issue subpoenas, and when those challenges have reached the courts have been very deferential to Congress, and these traditions really date back a long time. We've listed two cases that were both, that both arose in very fraught circumstances. The McGrain case back in the 20s, where Congress was, bringing in an attorney general and asking for information. And this seems to be, perhaps an intrusion into the executive branch, but the Supreme Court found that that was, part of Congress's role and lawful, and founded in the Constitution. So and this was, granting Congress very broad powers. So Congress's powers and authorities have been upheld by the Supreme Court multiple times. The Eastland case is another seminal case from the 70s in the context of the conflict in Southeast Asia, and so very controversial exercise of Congress's authority to go into the business of the U.S. Servicemen's Fund in a very politically fraught landscape. But again, the Supreme Court was very deferential to Congress and its authorities. So really, it was very recently in the Trump versus Mazars case that we saw the Supreme Court express some hesitation about the lengths to which Congress could go in seeking information relating to executive branch officials and authorities. And in that case, the requests were mostly upheld, but the Supreme Court did say that the subpoena would need to be related to and in furtherance of a legitimate task of Congress, and implied that there are some limits to what information Congress can request, and that it has to be consistent with its lawmaking powers and its mission. So I think there's probably still some conflict to play out in this area, given that Mazars is such a recent case. But for now, Congress's authorities are still very broad.
It seemed like
doesn't mean that you can't.
before that. It seemed like before that there was an assumption on the High Court that the thing that Congress was looking at was legitimate. They didn't second guess it, and Mazars kind of opens the door that we're actually going to tell the federal courts, let's get behind why you're doing this.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean that you, in responding to a congressional request, don't have options and don't have some cards to play. In other words, I don't think Congress can, has really and we'll talk about this, has the ability to really press forward and demand, a huge slew of information and testimony from everybody in the world. So you do have some ability to, negotiate the limits of Congress's authority in direct contact with Congress. But I think it's a negotiation more than, you don't have the ability to just take it up to court and say this, Congress can't seek this, because the court's unlikely to find that Congress's powers are limited in that way. So why don't we go to the next slide and talk about the committee authorities and how that works in practice. And Janice, you have such extensive experience. Maybe you can talk about that a bit.
So in the interest of time, I will actually be brief for this slide. And so congressional staff can reach out to you on a wide variety of topics just to have a general inquiry. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be brought before Congress. It can mean that you're just being brought in to have a private and exclusive conversation. They can demand documents, they can demand testimony, they can issue subpoenas. And each of the committees that are standing in Congress has their own rules governing when they can utilize a subpoena and how they have to operate. The committee that often has the most latitude and the greatest reach is the House Oversight Committee. Most of the rules are formed at the beginning of each new Congress. And so that's why you're seeing Rule X here, the organization of committees. You can look at Rule X or one of the sort of easier and lighthearted reads would be a CRS oversight manual. It's about 120 pages, published in 2019, and they kind of update it with 1 or 2 pages. I'm not suggesting you read the entire 120 pages, but they do have a chart that outlines the breadth of each committee's jurisdiction and also how they can trigger their subpoena requirements. So whether it's in the authority of the chair to act alone, or they have to act with the majority of the members of that particular committee. So Amy gets the joy of talking about the next slide.
Yes, this is really, how does Congress enforce its authority? And I've dealt with this with a witness who was trying to delay cooperation with a congressional inquiry, and so I've looked into these authorities personally. So Congress does have the authority to enforce its subpoenas, and there are really 3 different ways that Congress can pursue enforcement. One is that Congress can ask the Department of Justice to prosecute criminal contempt violations. So Congress has to first go through the internal process of finding someone in contempt, and that's actually quite a burdensome process that takes, depending on the committee and its rules, that takes a certain, a number of votes and so forth. And so it's not very common, but it has happened in recent history, of course, with Steve Bannon, who was held in contempt and then prosecuted and convicted. And I believe that conviction is on appeal. So we'll see if the law changes in this area based on that appeal. But for now, that stands as a successful exercise of Congress's enforcement powers through criminal contempt proceedings. Another means for Congress to enforce its authorities is for Congress to go to the district court and seek enforcement through a civil proceeding. And that we have a couple cases where Congress took this route, sort of well-known back in the Bush administration in the tangles with Harriet Miers, and then more recently with respect to Don McGahn, President Trump's White House counsel. So Congress has taken this step recently as well. Again, there are very complicated rules that Congress has to follow to do this, but it is possible, and those are the most common means for Congress to pursue the enforcement of its subpoenas. There is also in the law an opportunity for Congress to actually arrest an individual, but that hasn't been used in this century, and so we don't expect to see that. My understanding is there is no place for Congress to actually detain someone who's arrested under this authority, so that seems unlikely. But the criminal prosecution and civil enforcement have been used and will be going forward, I believe. So if we want to go to the next slide, I think, Janice, you wanted to talk a little bit about these limits, and we'll each chime in on these limits.
So we were asking Amy if you could talk about the Fifth Amendment and the attorney-client privilege, and Mark and I will come in with the scope of subpoena.
Sure. So the Fifth Amendment is actually, well, let me just back up and say that Congress has not always recognized that these limitations exist. And when you have a conversation with certain members or committee staff, they will sometimes tell you, well, actually, we don't agree that these privileges are available to someone when we seek information. But in practice, Congress has actually deferred to these privileges. And we've seen that recently with the Fifth Amendment, when Martin Shkreli was called to testify about the collapse of his company and exercise the Fifth Amendment. And he was, in fact, prosecuted. So that was a valid exercise. And Congress just let him exercise that privilege and did not try to force his testimony. The attorney-client privilege is another one where I've had staff say to me, actually, we don't respect that. We want the information. But in fact, they have not gone to try to press that in court. And I think that they are a little bit wary about what courts would do. And in fact, in the Eastman case, which is a fairly recent case, John Eastman tried to prevent the January 6th committee led by Chairman Thompson. So this is Eastman versus Thompson. John Eastman tried to prevent that committee from obtaining his emails, which were held on the Chapman University server where he had been a faculty member. And the district court judge in that case, had briefing and looked at the issue and decided that in fact Eastman did have an attorney-client privilege as to some of the information, but he went through all of the disputed records and decided that some had to be turned over and some could be withheld. And so at least that district court judge found that there is an attorney-client privilege that applies to committee requests, and I don't think that was appealed. I think that was resolved, but we're now seeing some judges recognize this privilege, and I think that that's actually what Congress is going to have to recognize, that the privilege does apply. So let me allow you all to talk further about the scope issue.
Well, I'll just quickly talk about Trump v. Mazars and say, Amy, you did a wonderful job setting the table for Trump v. Mazars. Just a reminder that at the time, there were 3 separate committees that were seeking the financial records for Donald Trump. It was the Intelligence Committee, the House Financial Services Committee, and the Oversight Committee. And to say that their reach was broad, it was broad, wide, and deep. And the establishment of the Mazars test is just a very new test. Note that we are now looking at George Santos, and this test has to be applied in a particular way. So Mazars is actually relevant right now and today. And Mark, I will hand it over to you to talk about Bragg v. Jordan.
Sure, yeah, and the importance of Mazars can't be overstated, and we really do commend it to you. The reader that we have that will go along with this presentation gives you a chance to see what the Supreme Court current thinking is. We're going to go, so among the things that it addresses is attorney-client privilege. It doesn't turn on that, but importantly, the Chief Justice makes pretty clear that he thinks that common law privileges do act as an obstacle to congressional authority. So really opens up, it's dicta, but it's pretty important dicta. Here with the scope of the subpoena, so it's just been interesting to see how the House Judiciary Committee, seeking to get the testimony of a former employee in the DA's office in New York, the back and forth. First the district court, essentially the challenge about whether there's actually a jurisdictional hook that would allow the federal government through the U.S. Congress to reach into a district attorney's office and compel testimony, at least from a former employer or not. So important questions are being determined even now.
Yep, let's go to the next slide. We've actually been talking about these issues, but just to point out that these materials will be provided in the message that we send to everyone who's participating, as I said earlier. And let's go advance one more slide, because I think we've actually just covered the Trump versus Mazars and Bragg cases. And we also received a request in the Q&A for the report that you mentioned previously, Janice. So we're going to send the citation.
Sure.
Those materials with the email that we sent out following the presentation. So we're going to talk briefly about why does Congress conduct investigations, because that does inform how you need to respond to their inquiry when you receive one. And Mark, I think you're going to go with the clip on the next slide.
Great. Yeah, if we could flip to the, so yeah, before we tee this up, so of course we talked about the authorities by which Congress does its investigations. Again, before we get to tax, we have to understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's and so this tees up that conversation. If we could take a look at this clip, please.
Because the American people need the truth about the threat TikTok poses to our national and personal security. TikTok collects nearly every data point imaginable, from people's location to what they type and copy, who they talk to, biometric data, and more. Even if they've never been on TikTok, your trackers are embedded in sites across the web. TikTok surveils us all. And the Chinese Communist Party is able to use this as a tool to manipulate America as a whole. We do not trust TikTok will ever embrace American values, values for freedom, human rights, and innovation. TikTok has repeatedly chosen the path for more control, more surveillance, and more manipulation. Your platform should be banned.
So we picked this recent opening statement from the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. You can see that the committee had brought in the CEO of TikTok. We picked her opening statement because it seemed to check sort of all the boxes of why it is that Congress comes to do its oversight work, and it raises all the ways in which that they examine an effort to affect regulator behavior, affect the behavior of companies, to shame those companies, an effort to build the predicate for public policy making, to advance a particular political narrative or interpose an obstacle to someone else's political narrative. So all these competing, or not competing, but all these reasons can inform or be the reason that sets in motion a congressional inquiry in the first instance. And it's very important to do an assessment of why is it they're looking at this in the first instance. Really taking us back to what Janice talked about, is why they're filling this empty vessel with a particular thing.
Yeah, I think what's also important about this slide is that you need to look at, what Congress's purpose is and what they're getting at. And if you are on the receiving end of an inquiry, you need to understand that so that you can navigate your client's best interests. So what do we need to provide in order to respond effectively and maximize our interests, not only with respect to responding to the congressional inquiry, but also there are always lots of other considerations to take into account, especially in a high profile case like the TikTok example. So you're going to have, what is Congress trying to achieve, but you're also going to have to take into account what the other issues are that your client may have. So is there, a potential criminal investigation of some sort, whether, federal Department of Justice or some other authority that's looking into these same issues, and that's often the case. There are always, in a high profile situation, public relations concerns, and your company is going to have public relations goals, and how you respond to Congress is going to definitely have an impact there, because it's often in a public hearing, and you're going to be subject to the press reporting on that public hearing. If you have a story that you don't want to be made public in that way, sometimes you can try to avoid having your client present testimony or testify in a public hearing. Sometimes Congress will agree to have a, even a member's briefing in, not in public. I've had that happen before, where they agree to do it behind closed doors, and that is often better and protects your client's interest better, but is not always feasible. But you're going to have to take that into account. And then also, just other issues. Are there lawsuits? Is there civil litigation that could come out of this, or whatever is made public in the course of the hearing? So you'll often have a situation with very complex problems, and it's not just the congressional inquiry, but all of these other collateral consequences that you have to think about when you determine how to respond to the congressional inquiry.
It's all to say that which you share with the Congress can ultimately become public, whether documents or things behind closed doors, and these things need to be handled with due care. So Janice, you covered this a little bit on how committees investigate.
So we filled you with a lot of information, and now we're going to talk about how that information could be viewed depending on who is talking to you. And I will, emphasize the point that Mark raised, which is those outside stakeholders really do have an influence on what goes on in both the personal office level and in the committee level. So let's take a request from a staffer. I know that we are painting a picture, and it's often we're skewing towards like, this is the worst case scenario that can happen. Sometimes a staffer, there are staffers who are like 21 years old. This is their first job out of college, and they might be reaching out to you with or without the member's knowledge, just asking questions about your company because they're curious. I mean, it can be that innocent. And then there's also the staffer who is hearing from constituents caring from constituents in the district or in the state or from industry, and they're trying to start their early kind of inquiries and to learn more about something. Sometimes they're crafting legislation. There's a variety of reasons that a staffer or a member of Congress can be reaching out to you to engage in a briefing or a discussion. The points we raised previously is to highlight that sometimes you can go in for a very innocent reason, and it turns out that they find something more. Like oh, we've hid that for years, was a statement I heard once. And I was like, hid what? I'm sorry. Now let me reach out to a colleague in another committee and let them know, I was meeting with so-and-so. And they were talking about some record. Did you meet with them already? Oh, I did. They didn't mention anything about it. I think you should bring them back in.
I think one important point to make here, Janice, is to your points that you can ask, right? It may just be a simple inquiry from a staff member. And sometimes when you receive a letter or even a phone call or an email, you assume that it's a huge thing and maybe it's not. So you need to engage in that dialogue and find out and then figure out maybe this is actually something you can deal with quite easily, or maybe it's a really big situation that you're going to have to spend a lot of time preparing for. Is that fair?
Yes, Amy, that is fair. And so going on to the other three, and I know we have limited time. Members can act in their own capacity and write you a letter. And so when you're getting a letter, some individuals, when they get a letter from Elizabeth Warren, their heart stops. She has a very big platform. And so you know that something is under the hood when Elizabeth Warren is sending you a letter, and how you respond to that letter, takes like a discernment, right? So each of these things, you don't necessarily have to respond to every single request again in a letter, but it takes a little bit of discernment. It doesn't have the same weight as when a chair from a committee that has of jurisdiction is asking you for key information. When you're getting a letter from a chair, that chair has subpoena power. The member of Congress does not have the ability to subpoena your records unless they work in concert with the chairman of a particular committee. Ranking members have just enough power to make your life a little complicated. So it goes back to Amy's point that she raised about a public relations campaign, because there can be things that are happening in Congress that, again, it is designed to slow, neutralize, or highlight behavior and has nothing to do with legislation at all. So when you receive a letter from either a chair or ranking member, it behooves you to acknowledge the receipt of the letter. And then when we go into a subpoena, well, that brings in another kettle of fish, because of course you're anticipated to respond to a subpoena when it's asked. That's when Congress is using its ultimate power to compel you to testify, to compel you to turn in documents, and then this becomes a full legal battle. Amy, Mark?
Yeah.
Any additional comments here?
No, why don't we just go to the next slide briefly? And I think this is really just what I was just talking about. When you receive a request, you should immediately find out what's behind it. So acknowledge the inquiry quickly and respectfully, and then just find out, and this is the same thing I would do with the Justice Department subpoena is, call and find out what exactly do you need. This is going to be very burdensome. Let me see if I can help you get what you really need. And the same thing is true here. Just make that contact. And then if you need to, figure out how to address it, you want to assemble your team. And if it does seem like it's going to have the kind of collateral consequences we were talking about earlier, take the time to figure out what are our goals, what does the committee really want, how can we respond to that most efficiently and most narrowly to protect all of our other interests, and especially can you work behind the scenes and get them what they need in a way that minimizes the collateral consequences. Why don't we go to the next slide and start giving some examples?
Yeah, very good. Okay, this is some of the missteps, so we'll leave the best for the last. So if we go to the next slide here, before we start, I'll tee it up for you. Robinhood was the center of this sort of GameStop meltdown last Congress. In this clip, we're going to hear from the CEO of Robinhood, who's been called to testify and answer, among other things, why its customers couldn't access its accounts, for example. So if we tee this up and play it, please.
And this was on Zoom. This was during COVID.
Right, which presents some both advantages and disadvantages that you'll see.
Green of making investing accessible, especially for people without a lot of money. The stock market is a powerful wealth creator, but half of U.S. households participate in it.
Mr. Chair, I would like you to use your limited time to talk directly to what happened January 28th and your involvement in it.
Certainly.
Madam Chair, the witness has the opportunity to give their own testimony.
Excuse me, you are not,
For your questioning.
you are not recognized, Mr. Please go right ahead and speak directly to the question. Mr. McHenry, yes, of course.
We created Robinhood to economically empower all Americans by opening financial markets to them. I was born in Bulgaria, a country with a financial system that was on the verge.
Okay, you can see there, our word of wisdom here is you don't win congressional hearings. And so Mr. Tanev is trying his very best to persuade the Congress and whoever's watching this that Robinhood is an awesome company. He comes from a rags to riches story and so on and so forth. And that's not why the panel called him. They want to examine a particular thing. So going in knowing that your purpose is not to win the day. You're not actually the main event. It's the members that are the main event. We want to move on to the next one.
What do you do if you're called to testify? Let's play this slide and I will preview it by saying, be prepared. Please play the slide.
Would you commit to that, not selling the data you collect?
Congressman, I believe we don't sell data to any data brokers.
You don't sell to anyone.
We don't sell data to data brokers.
I didn't ask you data brokers, you sell it to anyone. In other words, under our bill, you can only use the data for your own purposes, not to sell it to anyone. Would you commit to not selling your data to anyone?
Congressman, I actually am in support of some rules.
I didn't ask you whether the rules, I asked you whether the company, TikTok, would commit to not selling its data to anyone and just using it for its own purposes internally.
I can get back to you on the details.
Okay, get back to me. All right. Another thing that's in our bill says that we would prohibit targeting marketing to people under the age of 17. Would you be willing to agree to prohibit targeted marketing to people, Americans under the age of 17?
Congressman, we have actually stricter rules for advertisers in terms of what they can show to our
So
users.
do you prohibit would you be willing to prohibit targeted marketing to those under 17? That's what's in our bill.
I understand that there's some talk and some legislation around the country.
Well, again, I'm not interested. I wanted you to make that commitment without the legislation, since you say you're.
So when you're testifying before a member of Congress that has made public statements and crafted legislation, all of these questions are foreseeable. We're not trying to pick on Mr. Chu today, even though we have 2 clips in a row, but it is to demonstrate that when you're going to testify before a member of Congress, it's really important to understand what their history has been, the statements that they've made in the past, so that you can anticipate the questions and being prepared for them. All of Mr. Pallone's questions were foreseeable. And then Mr. Chu ends up looking like he was completely unprepared, especially when Mr. Pallone says, we have legislation on this.
And you can imagine what you're going to be asked. You can think through how you're going to answer, right?
Yeah.
So,
you know, you can prepare and prepare and prepare, but this wasn't an instance where someone had a moment where they just simply forgot. It was clear that he was not prepared. You want to move on to the next slide, or Amy, do you have anything to add?
No, I think the next slide really helps sum it up in what you were just saying, and I'm not sure we're going to have time for anything beyond this, but the point of this slide is what can you do now to protect your client? And I think what Janice was just talking about in terms of preparation is exactly what you can do. And we have people who are monitoring what's going on in Congress for our clients so that we can help anticipate. You know, we think this member is interested in this issue, and we want you to be, you know, pulling together a strategy in order to prepare for a potential request coming from this committee. We do that. Our legislative and public policy group does that with our, you know, clients every day, and we're constantly thinking ahead and trying to follow what's going on in Congress so that we can help clients prepare and be ready. And again, to minimize the potential damage to their long-term interests, and to work with Congress when they're interested in what our clients are doing, to work with them to get them the information that they need with minimal damage to our clients' interests. So Mark and Janice, I don't know if you have anything to say, or if you want to run that last clip, we maybe have one minute to do it, but we're toward the end.
Well, we can just wrap up maybe. So I would just simply say, look, if you imagine from our presentation that we think Congress is out there to eat your lunch. You're right. But the mere fact that there's risk doesn't mean you can't guard against it. And a thoughtful plan of thinking about how and what ways can we be exposed, and maybe from angles that you don't right now appreciate, can give rise to a proactive strategy that can help guard against these risks. So the risks are real, and they're probably even broader and from places that you might not expect. But there are some smart ways to guard against it. And if you do get looked at, there are some ways that you can minimize your exposure.
So I'll just say one quick thing, Amy. I know we only have a few seconds. We run a very bipartisan shop. And so as a result, you're able to hear perspectives that are both related to what's happening on either side of the aisle and being able to communicate that effectively when engaging Capitol Hill. And then we are proud to work with Amy with the white collar group so that we can protect you from other types of risks that arise. Amy?
That's the perfect conclusion. Thank you, Janice, and thank you, Mark, for all your insights. This has been terrific. I just want to mention that we are going to send a follow-up message to everyone with a link to the evaluation for this presentation, the CLE credit information, the slides and other materials that we cited in the presentation, and then also the authorities that Janice mentioned, which we will add to that. And again, please don't hesitate to contact us directly, and thank you all for participating.